My guest today is Andrew Bieszad. He has an MA in Islamic Studies from Hartford Seminary with a concentration in the Islamic equivalent of dogmatic theology. He is the author of Lions of the Faith, Saints, Blesseds, and Heroes of the Catholic Faith in the Struggle with Islam, available from Lux Orbis Press. He is a sought-after writer and speaker on Islamic topics, and he is currently the most popular writer on 1 Peter 5 with over 42,000 page views on just 2 posts. Welcome to the podcast, Andrew.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, I'd like you to give me a little bit of background on you. How did you get into Islamic studies?
Well, it's a rather interesting story. When I was about 12, 13 years old, I was interested in reading unique writers. And I was reading Dante, Karl Marx, so forth. And one of those I picked up was, I just finished reading Up from Slavery by, I forget the author's name, but he's a very famous American author. And I decided I wanted to read another book that was from a different perspective. And I came across Malcolm X's autobiography of Malcolm X at a used book sale. And I read it, and I was fascinated with his conversion to Islam and his life story. What particularly fascinated me about Malcolm X was that Malcolm X was a person who believed in Islam, this religion at the time, I didn't know anything about it, and that for some reason he could say that it was a peaceful religion, yet it also allowed him to do violent things and say violent things.
Right.
And the question then becomes, now obviously as you know, Malcolm X became much more peace-oriented toward the end of his life before he was murdered. But the question then became, what does this thing called Islam actually teach? So I went to my middle school library, and I got a copy of the Quran. And I read that, and I found the same problem again. You can find pieces in the Quran that are legitimately humane and decent, but you also find pieces that are horrendously violent. And this is not something like you might see people talk about biblical texts where God went out and killed 40,000 Amalekites or so forth. This is a personal command to murder those who oppose your will, and Allah does what He wills, and you are to abuse these people and make them pay an onerous tax of willing submission until they themselves feel subdued. Quran chapter 9, verse 29 is one example. And so I did not understand how could one hold two completely contradictory views at the same time. It almost seemed like there should be some sort of cognitive dissonance that should happen. And so I started reading some more. And when I couldn't find answers, I decided to turn to the classical sources of Islamic theology or Islamic sacred tradition. It's called the Hadith. I should also note that at the time I was not interested in listening to what other people said about Islam. For instance, you have good speakers like Robert Spencer, who writes some very good works, but I didn't know much about him, and because I didn't know much about Islam, I did not want to take what he said on faith. Likewise, I did not want to simply take Muslim missionary propaganda and believe that on faith either, because that would be just as erroneous. I wanted to see what Islam said in its own writings.
Seems like a sensible course of action.
Yes, it is. So I thought. And sure enough, I just became more engrossed by this. I picked up a copy of the most popular hadith collection and the most respected, the Sahih al-Bukhari, and all 9 volumes, English and Arabic, parallel text, and I read that. Then I went to a local mosque and I picked up a copy of Sahih Muslim, which is another very highly respected collection of Islamic sacred tradition. And I just continued from there, and sure enough, within a few years I had acquired a library of classical Islamic texts. I was interested in learning Arabic, and I found that my original observations about Islam had not changed, except what became more apparent to me is that there were fewer parts that were actually so-called peace-minded, or I should even say humane-minded, and many more parts that were much more violent or deviant or just disgusting and disturbing. And this really comes out when you read Islamic sacred tradition, because the thing most people don't understand is that although we have much more to our Catholic faith and sacred tradition than just the Bible contains both the words that God said and the things that God did. Islam does not do this. So, for instance, when Jesus is preaching the Beatitudes, the Bible says, Jesus went up to the mountain with his disciples, and he sat down and he began to teach them. And then he starts speaking. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, and so forth. What Islam does is they will separate Jesus' speech, for instance, and that would be the Quran, And then the hadith would be the context, the part where Jesus walked up the mountain and sat down with his disciples.
Okay.
So by putting the Quran and the hadith together, you can get a complete picture of Islamic history, theology, and belief. And when you put these together, Islam becomes something that's really a rather disturbing religion. I would say founded by a 7th century Arabian madman who, I can say based on the tradition, claimed he was demonically possessed, promoted pedophilia, some cases bestiality, necrophilia, murder, assassinations, rape, and every other heinous sin that you can think of.
Sounds like a great guy to have at a party, huh?
Oh, he is a great guy to have at a party. Just don't have any booze.
So for those of you at home who might be picking up a little bit of background noise, Andrew is coming to us from an undisclosed location somewhere in Connecticut. He is at a coffee shop. So if you heard Little Red Corvette playing through the background, that's why. So I did want to ask a question about, your graduate studies were done at Hartford Seminary. So that's a non-denominational graduate school. Were you Catholic at that time?
Yes, I've always been Catholic ever since I was born, and I obviously have chosen to persist in my faith.
So what attracted you to that school?
Hartford Seminary is really a nifty place because it was the first place in the country that ever had an Islamic studies program.
Okay.
You see, Catholic missionaries, when they went to the Muslim world, they went through one of the religious orders, usually the Franciscans or Dominicans. In the case of the Protestant missionaries, and this is mainline Protestant I'm speaking of, they went through Hartford Seminary. Now, this is because Hartford Seminary's Islamic Studies program was founded, I think, in 1895 by a couple of Scottish Presbyterian ministers, one of them being Duncan Black MacDonald, who came to the Hartford area and settled and began to teach. Hartford Seminary was traditionally a Congregationalist school. They trained and still do train ministers for the Congregationalist Church. What's interesting about Hartford Seminary is that they had done a lot of missionary outreach to Muslims, and I should say very good missionary outreach from a Protestant point of view. However, around 1950, their missionaries came back and they had a very interesting report. They claimed that Muslims already knew God and they did not have a need for hearing about Jesus or Christian missionary work and salvation and so forth because they already knew God and obviously they were already saved. Around 1975, the seminary officially secularized. It still trained ministers of the Congregationalist Church, but it considered itself a, quote, interfaith seminary. And their Islamic studies program went from being something of really studying Islam from a critical point of view to, quote, understanding and tolerance and interfaith relations. And what's happened now is the seminary has not become yet, but is in the process of becoming a Muslim seminary, where Muslims go to train to be Muslim missionaries. And keep in mind, this was 100 years ago, produced some of the best Protestant minds for Islamic studies that were against Islam.
Wow.
Yeah, the transition's amazing.
That's incredible. Well, I mean, I guess in a way, it speaks again to the questions that I want to ask you. So your piece, the one that was published second, called "What Did the Saints Say About Islam?" It's the most read article we've published to date. It by itself has over 38,000 page views.
Wow.
And it's resonating with people. And I think that, the quotes that you pulled from the saints, especially those saints who dealt with or were martyred by the Islamic occupation of Spain that lasted the better part of 800 years, these are not diplomatic or ecumenical quotes towards Islam. Why do you think that what's being said in that article is resonating with people so strongly?
Because people know the truth. I mean, people who I've spoken to many different people in many different areas for the better part of, my goodness, 7, almost 8 years now. And I find that a lot of people know there is something fundamentally wrong with Islam in spite of what a lot of these socialist and far left-wing types say, that Islam is the religion of peace and that, if you do not believe this, you are some kind of racist or bigot or you just hate Muslims, and so forth. They know that something is fundamentally wrong with this religion, but they do not have the knowledge, the training, or the skills to understand why. And I do not fault them for this. It'd be like me knowing something is wrong with our financial system, yet not yet lacking the knowledge to explain how derivatives work, how money supply and money creation work, simply because I don't have that knowledge. And I think it's resonating because someone like me who has that knowledge, who has that training, who's invested himself for, 16, almost 17 years into this endeavor,
sure,
can understand and articulate this in a way that is simple, makes sense, and connects with what they know.
Yeah. I mean, and you mentioned in the first piece that you wrote for 1 Peter 5, which was called The Dialogue Delusion, that you had sort of, I guess you would call them thinly veiled death threats the first day of classes in your Islamic studies program.
Yes.
So, I want to know about that, but I also, I'm wondering if intimidation really plays a role in people's willingness to say what they really think about Islam, and then sort of the converse of that, watching the things that are going on in the Middle East, is that making people angry enough that they're starting to say, you know what, I'm going to actually say what I really think.
In the Quran, chapter 8, verse 12, Muhammad says that Allah says, وَقَالَ لَهُ إِلَى الْمَلَائِكَ أَنَا مَعْكُمْ سَأَلْقِي عَرَابِ فِي قُلُوبَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. Verily Allah said to the angels, I am with thee. I will strike terror into the hearts of the infidels. Terrorism in Islam, people think that terrorism is a tactic meant to bring about just plain fear. That is completely incorrect. The purpose of terrorism is to do things. First is to stop disagreement with Islamic teaching, which is for the greater end, which is the conversion of people to Islam. Mm-hmm. That is why it exists. So the terrorism that you see, and people are legitimately afraid because Islam does legitimize violence against those who do not believe in it or oppose it. Keep in mind, I say it legitimizes it; it does not mandate it.
Sure.
So for the actual distinction in Islamic law is something that's called maqbul, which means it is permissible. In the words of Muhammad, la dirar wa la darur. It's neither harmful nor helpful. So you can choose to do it, you can choose not to do it, but there is no sin involved. The same with ISIS. This is the reason why you say people can say, well, I have Muslim neighbors and they're not violent, and maybe they are not, because they do not have to be violent. However, should they choose to, at any moment's notice, they can do that, and there is no sin attached to that. There's nothing morally wrong with that. So that is, I think, one of the big issues when it comes to talking about Islam with people. With people today. It's good that people are finally starting to talk about it more, because the main issue with Islam is that its danger is real. It's not a peaceful religion. It's not something that's nice. And what these saints said, they told it like it was. And that's the reason I wrote the article. A bit of background to this. When I was in grad school, I found a book. It was written in Russian. I also speak Russian. And it was a book of what the Orthodox Church calls the Neo-Martyrs. Neo-martyrs are martyrs that basically came after the rise of Islam, and most of them have something to do with Islam.
Okay.
And I read through this book, and I'm thinking, wow, the Orthodox have quite a few. I wonder what our Catholic faith has. So I found one, and then I found another, and sure enough, it just snowballed.
Well, that makes sense. I mean, how long did they spend sweeping across North Africa and Southern Europe?
North Africa, Amr ibn al-As invaded Egypt and took Fustat, burned it in 639 A.D. Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed Morocco into Spain in 711, so about 80 years. And at the same time, we also forget that the Muslim world waged a continual jihad via piracy since its inception until about the year 1860, 1870.
Okay.
So you're talking the better part of 1,300 years here.
Would this be the Barbary pirates that we're talking about?
Yes. Barbary pirates, most of them put that period of history from something of around 1,500 to 1,700, but the Barbary pirates have been around much longer than that. They were infamous for what's called Anukhas, the white slave trade. Mm-hmm. Two religious orders were founded solely to counteract their influence, the Mercedarians and the Trinitarians. All the saints I've written about in my book, Lines of the Faith. And they were a real scourge. I mean, people do not understand how dangerous, how much of a threat these people played, and how many things they were involved in. It wasn't just capturing people. It was military invasions. It was spying. It was weapons running, what we'd call gun running today, money running. And these connections went very deep. You even actually, and I wrote about this in my book, you actually had at one point Calvinist revolutionaries who were working for better part of about 100 years in various stages with the Barbary pirates and with the Ottoman Empire to try to have a land invasion of the Catholic countries in Europe. It's known as Turco-Calvinism, the phenomenon.
Wow. I've never even heard of it.
Yep. You can't make this stuff up. Actually, in my book, I have a picture of a medal that was worn by Dutch Protestant sailors who were allies of the Muslims. Now, these people are Calvinist Protestants. And
Right.
it's a medal actually in the shape of a crescent moon. And on one side it says, "Better a Turk than a papist." In the back it says, in spite of the Mass.
Wow. Better
Yeah.
a Turk than a papist.
Better a Turk than a papist.
So you're threatened on your first day of classes. You're told
Oh,
that
yeah.
because you believe, in Catholicism and not in Islam, that, you technically deserve to die.
Yes.
How does this interaction shape your course of study, as you work toward your degree? A lot of people would have been probably put off by that right away and said, I think I'm going to go look at interior decorating or something else. But you persisted. And so how did that, did it add impetus to your desire to understand what this was all about?
It only fueled my beliefs that I already had that I needed to be here and I needed to study. The professor who admitted me to Hartford Seminary, her name was Dr. Jane Smith. I believe she teaches at Harvard University now. She is quite liberal, and she and I have actually had some public disagreements about Islam before, but I have a lot of respect for her because when she admitted me to the program, she said, your opinions are very different than most of the people here, but that's what we need here. We need to have a different voice, somebody who has different views to add balance. So I can respect that definitely from an academic point of view.
You bring up a good point, though. Why is it, do you think, that the progressives of this country and really throughout the West, who seem to believe in things that are so antithetical to the Muslim practices of morality and religion and the way that they treat women, why are they so big on promoting this religion as laudable when they look to undercut Christianity at every turn?
Because they push their own view of what they would like it to be upon it. For instance, it's almost like someone who's delusional. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. If they believe this particular viewpoint of Islam, and they see it as a power struggle. They see this as a power struggle. And this is a problem that you find within our government in particular. People say America's a Christian country. I disagree. We have a lot of Christians in the country, but we're really a secular country. And one of the issues one of the ways this really plays out is how we deal with the Muslim world. We ally with, and this is not just America, this is many other governments that have come before us. Islam, when it is in a large body of people, it significantly influences their way of thinking, modus operandi, and lifestyle, to the point where they can be actually very easily manipulated. And so many governments have figured this out, going back all the way to Pippin and Charlemagne. You can see this. The problem, though, with Islam is, as Hilaire Baloch pointed out in his book, I think it was on Mohammedanism, he said that Islam's spiritual foundation remains unmovable. And ultimately, that is the issue, that you can control Muslims and Islam for a time, but they always rise up and rebel, and usually victoriously.
Yeah, he mentioned that again in Survivals and New Arrivals as well.
Yes, and this is very, very true. The progressives, I believe, and this is just my experience dealing with it, they think that this is a power struggle between the Christians and the Muslims, and they think that they can divide and conquer and really fill the power vacuum once that opens up. The problem is, Islam solely moves into power vacuums. That is the only way that it has ever conquered. Wherever Christianity has become divided into disarray or has collapsed from society is where Islam grows best.
Or where we topple strongmen,
Yes.
dictators who kept Islamic regimes suppressed, like we saw in Iraq and in Egypt. And
Exactly. People criticize Bashar al-Assad for being, quote, the butcher of Syria, and he wasn't a nice guy. He was not nice. The thing that most people do not understand about Assad was Assad was an Alawite. Alawites are a heretical sect of Shia Islam. They actually worship Muhammad as a god, alongside his cousin Ali, and one of Muhammad's converts to Islam called Salman the Persian. They actually have their own trinity.
wow.
And these people constitute approximately 1/5 of Syria's population.
Okay.
So you have 1/5 of Alawites, 1/5 are regular Shiites, 1/5 are Christians of various sects, most of them Orthodox Christians, but many Catholics and many members of the Assyrian Church of the East, and then you have 1/5 are Sunni Muslims. The Alawite family has the Alawite minority has a vested interest in keeping the peace between the different groups in this particular case, because they know that if they do not keep the peace and a war breaks out, they will get butchered. They know this.
Okay.
So us going into that country as one example, we just created division and we opened up a power vacuum that Orthodox Islam can move into, and then you see the fruits of it.
Right, exactly. And so, we're touching on sort of the interplay between Christianity and Islam in the Middle East. So I wanted to bring up that the Archbishop of Mosul recently released a statement on what's happening to his flock and what has happened in Iraq. I'd like to read you a quote. He wrote, quote, "Our sufferings today are the prelude of those you, Europeans and Western Christians, will also suffer in the near future. I lost my diocese. The physical setting of my apostolate has been occupied by Islamic radicals who want us converted or dead. But my community is still alive. Please try to understand us. Your liberal and democratic principles are worth noting here. You must consider again our reality in the Middle East because you are welcoming into your countries an ever-growing number of Muslims. You also are in danger. You must take strong and courageous decisions, even at the cost of contradicting your principles. You think all men are equal, but that is not true. Islam does not say that all men are equal. Your values are not their values. If you do not understand this soon enough, you will become the victims of the enemy you have welcomed into your home." What do you make of that?
I have nothing to say to that because he has said everything. That is the problem. What these socialists have done by inviting these large Muslim populations in, whether they think they're being charitable or whether, from what I've seen, they think this is a power struggle in which they can divide and conquer.
Or just cheap labor.
Or just cheap labor, which is the case many times in Europe. What happens is you are inviting a group of people in, not only who does not share your values, but these people as he said, they want you converted or dead. And the Islamic plan does not work in 2 or 3 generations. I will tell you, there is a very famous Muslim speaker. He's actually down in Tennessee. He preaches at he's head imam at the mosque in Memphis. And he's also preaches a lot at the very large mosque, largest in the South, which is actually in Chattanooga. And his name, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember his name right now. But he said that we cannot think about conquering America within 2 or 3 generations. We have to look at 20 to 30 generations down the road and make plans that way.
Wow.
They're in this for the long haul.
Yeah.
They're in this for the long haul. And this is how Islam operates. Islam will wait 1,000 years to move into an area, and when an opportune time opens up, it will move in. It is very patient. There's a song, I think it was by the Rolling Stones, "Time is on my side."
Right.
That is how Islam operates.
And you see it everywhere. There's mosques popping up all over the place. I live in Northern Virginia and very close to Washington, D.C., and this is, an increasingly large population of Muslims and just Africans in general coming over that I've noticed. And it's a huge melting pot here anyway. In the Arlington school system, I think 40 or 45 different languages are spoken, native languages to the students who go to the school there. So it's a big melting pot anyway. But there's a very noticeable increase in the Islamic population here. And, it is a little bit concerning when you see the mosques popping up everywhere because you don't know what to think.
The mosque, I can tell you definitively, if you look at Islamic history and you go back, you read the hadith, you see that the mosque, it is a spiritual place, but it is also a place of military organization and operation. I'm going to mention this in my next article for your website.
You got ahead of me. I was going to ask you what the next one was going to be, but you beat me to my question.
This one is going to be about the concept of life under Islam, and the great Islamic scholar Ibn Taymiyyah put it very well. He said there are 2 domains. There is Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb. Dar al-Islam is the house of Islam. These are all persons who are Muslims and properties which are possessed or under Islamic rule. Then there is the Dar al-Harb, which is the house of war. And these are all non-Islamic persons and properties that are not possessed by Islam. And the idea is, and this is taught by Muhammad, that the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, will eventually assimilate the House of War into itself by divine providence. And this is much preached about in the Quran. Muhammad spoke about this, so this is not some new innovation, but this is rather the doctrinal explanation of Islamic sacred dogma. And this is very real. They believe this very much so. When I say they, I'm referring to the Orthodox scholars, of course. And it's a part of the religion. You don't have to believe it per se if you are an individual Muslim. However, it doesn't change the fact that that's the official teaching.
But basically, assimilation is the mode of operation.
Yes, assimilation and usurpation.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is assimilation doesn't always have to happen slowly and gradually over time. Sometimes it can be a rather violent process.
Oh, it can, but that is one of the end goals. As Muhammad said, "Al-ghaya yubarritu al-wisata." The end justify the means, just like for Machiavelli.
Right.
And this is another important concept to point out as well. Within Islam, as long as something is being done for fi sabilillah, for the cause of Allah, anything is permissible. Including murder, mayhem, lying, rape. This is all part of what's called in Islam taqiyya, or deception practice. Taqiyya literally actually means acting with piety, from the verb taqa. So the way you show your piety for Allah is by realizing His will on earth, by spreading Islam by all means possible.
Well, there's something to chew on, and actually we're out of time, so I really want to talk to you more, but I'd like to leave everyone with those delightful thoughts on what we're facing as a cultural force as it moves through not only the Middle East, but into the West. I have very little doubt that we will actually speak to you again, but I'm gratified that I have no hard network breaks that I'm up against like a radio host. I have room to play with my time, but I think our segment alone is almost a half hour, and I was planning on going with about 15 minutes, but that's great because the information is fantastic, and it's hard to get enough of it. So, we'll work on time management's not my best thing anyway, so that's fine. You have freedom. Hey, I'm in charge. I'm the publisher, right? So I can decide these things. So
absolutely.
I really, really, really want to thank you for being on and doing this interview with me. And I really appreciate, you writing these articles for us. They've been a huge success, and I think that they're answering a lot of questions for people. And I know you're way ahead of the game. You've always got 2 or 3 articles in the can before I even get a chance to look at them. So thank you for your prolific gift for educating us lowly Catholics about this religion that we know so little about.
Thank you for having me, or I should say for giving me the opportunity to do it. It's a distinct pleasure.
Great. Well, by our powers combined, we're going to teach people about this.
Amen.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Steve.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.